Good morning. You're with the House Ways and Means Committee. It's April 24th, 2025. And we're going to we're talking with the chair of the Cannabis Control Board, James Pepper.
Is it all right if I bring the Cannabis Control Board?
Sure.
An extra chair just for you. Right. Well, thank you for having me. My name is James Pepper. I'm the chair of the Cannabis Control Board, and I'm joined by the Cannabis Control Board General Counsel, Gabe Gilman.
Did you say his name again?
Gabe Gilman.
Thanks.
Yeah. And we're here to talk about cannabis fees. These fees were set for the first time in March of 2022, about 3 years ago. So this is actually a good time to start the conversation about kind of reevaluating them, see if there are kind of adjustments that need to be made. It's very challenging to know how to set fees for this industry or adjust them without some of the history of cannabis policy, both statewide and federally. I'd hate to be in the position of mansplaining or canna-splaining this industry, but and I know many of you have been deeply involved in this topic for a long time, so you kind of understand the landscape. But I think it's important just for everyone to be on the same page about this. Everything kind of starts with the Controlled Substance Act, which was signed into law by Richard Nixon. And it groups various substances into one of 5 schedules based upon their medical value and their abuse profile. So one being the most restrictive. Cannabis was placed into Schedule 1, meaning it has a high potential for abuse with currently no accepted medical uses. It's a little bit of a strange situation because, currently there's 41 states that have medical use programs. There's over kind of 30,000 physicians that recommend cannabis use, that are qualified to recommend cannabis use among those 41 states. And there's over 6 million people with medical cards in the country. But regardless, it's still a Schedule 1 controlled substance. That schedule includes things like ecstasy, LSD, heroin. Just by way of context, Schedule 2 contains cocaine, methamphetamine, Oxycontin, and fentanyl. So cannabis is treated as kind of more dangerous than fentanyl and Oxycontin, cocaine. The Schedule 1 carries the most severe federal penalties. Everyone kind of asks themselves, okay, well then how do we have 41 states that have a medical program? How do we have 26 states that have an adult use program? This started when Colorado, through a ballot initiative, voted to allow for adult use in 2013. At the time, the Department of Justice needed to decide whether they were going to allow this to happen. And so it was Eric Holder, Obama's first attorney general, asked his staff to create a kind of list of priorities that if Colorado followed that list or any state followed that list of priorities, that they would be deprioritized for prosecution and enforcement. So it was mostly around things like making sure that cartels and organized crime didn't get into the licensed industry, preventing kind of sales to kids, and making sure that legally grown cannabis wasn't diverted to non-legal states. Those are the kind of general framework that was laid out. So as long as the state regulatory structure met those priorities, the government would kind of turn a blind eye to the activity. In a weird twist of fate in 2018, the first Trump administration, Jeff Sessions, the attorney general, rescinded the Cole memoranda, the kind of those 8 priorities. There was a kind of collective gasp around the country. This is a $33 billion a year industry. Are the raids going to resume? Are all these businesses going to be prosecuted? That has largely not happened. A lot of the kind of foundation of the Cole memoranda has been baked into kind of just processes, both at the kind of financial crimes enforcement network and, all the state regulatory bodies. So while we exist in a world without the kind of this document protecting states to a certain degree, seems like not much has changed since the rescission of those memoranda. So, but that Schedule I, that legal status, has dramatic consequences for the state market here. Both on the state side and the licensees market participant side. So, if it weren't for the Schedule I status, you probably wouldn't have a cannabis control board at all. You might have one, but really the structure that makes the most sense when you kind of think about what we do is move cultivators under the jurisdiction of the Agency of Agriculture. So they would do all the regulation of the cultivation. The manufacturers, I mean, they're just commercial kitchens, really. So the Department of Health could oversee their kind of testing, compliance testing, sanitation, all the kind of things that they do to certify a commercial kitchen. And then the retailers would probably be overseen by some combination of the state police and the tax department. So that's kind of, but because any agency that has federal entanglements, federal money, like through grants, whatever else, they take the position, and this isn't just true in Vermont, this is every state, that they can't step foot in a cannabis business. So that's why you have kind of the cannabis board, which is sequestered, independent from any sort of federal entanglements. So that's why that's the kind of implication of Schedule I on the state side. On the business side, the federal government considers these sales of cannabis to be drug trafficking. So the profits cannot be deposited into a federally chartered FDIC insured bank. There's no lending by banks to start up a cannabis business. There's no lines of credit to make payroll at the end of the month or for whatever other reasons. There's no admitted insurers in this industry. So cannabis licensees have to rely on these kind of unregulated surplus line insurers that, can essentially charge whatever they want. There's no, of course, federal tax write-offs, no bankruptcy protection either. So, these businesses, they have all the challenges of a traditional startup without any of the kind of fiscal innovations or protections that we put in place to support other small businesses in other industries. I sometimes liken this to the kind of quote about Ginger Rogers, who needed to know all the same dance moves as Fred Astaire, but she had to do them backwards and in heels. So it's just when you hear cannabis business saying that they're struggling, it's not hyperbole generally. And then of course there's the Schedule I means that cannabis cannot cross state lines. So whether that be for kind of testing, manufacturing, sale, all of that has to be recreated in Vermont. You can't send even just samples for testing to out-of-state, testing labs, and all those businesses, all that kind of supply chain have to be kind of funded through private capital. So this is just kind of a very unique situation. And it also means that the board has to take a very kind of keen eye on supply and demand. So, if we oversupply the market, oversaturate the market with cannabis, then kind of prices crash and no one can make any money at all. And, all these businesses that kind of are risking all their own private capital go out of business. If we undersupply the market, prices go up, and already kind of cannabis is taxed at 20%. So, people just kind of shift over to the kind of illicit market or to kind of the intoxicating hemp market. So we kind of have to hit this balance pretty closely. Many other states deal with this basic kind of supply and demand problem by having a capped licensing system. You could say we're only going to issue 50 cultivation licenses this year, 50 retail licenses, 50 manufacturing licenses, see how it shakes out, and maybe next year we'll add more. There's some real benefits to that kind of system. One, it's easier for us to regulate, 50,000 square foot grow facility versus, 50,000 square foot ones. It's just easier from a regulatory side of things. Of course, you can also kind of try and perfectly locate those retail operations so that they're perfectly geographically dispersed. There are kind of advantages to that, and there's more price stability on the cannabis side. But there are trade-offs to that approach. It really rewards the well-capitalized multi-state operators that, you know, can craft the perfect application. They've got lawyers, they've got CPAs, lobbyists, and they can kind of get into the front of the line and kind of eat up all those licenses. It can create a secondary value to those licenses as well. So, you know, there's only 50, if you have this limited resource, you can sell your business for much more than the face value of the license, because it's just it's a rare resource. And then, you know, in the Vermont context, especially, what kind of the legislature was most compelling, I think, to the legislature was that we have never really been able to compete on volume with any of our kind of craft industries. We try and compete based upon quality and value added kind of craft market. And so kind of mass producing the kind of generic, you know, not innovative cannabis is going to just set us up for long-term failure when and if there ever is interstate commerce and legalization. We had a reputation pre-legalization for having some of the most exciting, you know, genetics, the most exciting cannabis in certainly New England, probably in the entire East Coast. And the legislature wanted to shift those people into the regulated market so that we could eventually compete with kind of the, you know, the bigger brands. So that's what you did. You opted for an uncapped licensing system. You told us to prioritize small craft cultivators. You defined that as 1,000 square feet or less. You gave us some levers to kind of moderate the supply of cannabis, modulate it so that we wouldn't get to this point of just oversaturation where there's just too much cannabis. You're growing more cannabis than anyone in Vermont or who's visiting Vermont could ever consume. You know, you've allowed us to shut down license types, or kind of regulate people up or down in their license types. So we have that's kind of what we do. A big part of our job is making sure that we're matching the demand for cannabis with the supply. It's a tough proposition to kind of understand supply and demand, given that there's factors outside of our control that implicate that. Tourism, for instance, plays a huge role in Vermont's economy, generally speaking. So, you know, we saw when the New York Times was kind of showing all this devastation in Montpelier and Vermont, you know, from the flooding 2 years ago, we saw the cannabis sales go down. And that ripples through kind of not just the retailers and the excise tax, but kind of all areas of the supply chain. You know, we're now seeing with this kind of, I guess, trade war with Canadian tourism down, we're seeing a kind of year over year decrease in cannabis revenue and I assume that this will be reflected in the rooms and meals taxes as well, but we'll see. Too early, I think, to tell right now. But all right, bringing this back to fees. This is kind of just table setting for fees. The first thing that the Cannabis Board was required to do when we were seated was to report back to this committee with a fee structure that was, and I'm quoting from the Act 164, sufficient to fund the duties of the Cannabis Control Board. So set the fees so that it covers our regulatory burden. Then it goes on to say that reporting requirement, if this is impossible, whether a portion of the excise tax should be allocated to the Cannabis Regulation Fund, which is the kind of enterprise fund where the fees are distributed or dispersed, to ensure that our statutory duties are met. So what we did is we hired an economist to estimate the demand for regulated cannabis in the state. That includes kind of tourism and what our neighboring states are doing. Because we're catching you know, like New Hampshire hasn't legalized, so all of their consumers are coming to Vermont, generally speaking, to buy our weed. We've used that kind of demand analysis to reverse engineer a market structure that met the kind of statutory goals of the market. So, you know, the priority for small cultivators and, you know, priority for people who have been disproportionately harmed by cannabis prohibition. And so we presented the legislature with two options. One, where you could set kind of astronomical fees compared to our neighboring states. And you got to remember, at the exact same time that we were coming online, New York was, and New Jersey and Connecticut were. So, you know, we were kind of looking at what are they setting their fees at? What are they setting these fees at? It it may have been able to cover our budget, just because, you know, with those types of fees, there'd be very little interest, there'd be a deterrent effect on seeking a license. So there'd be less market participants overall. So we would need kind of less staff to oversee the market. And then we gave an alternative that kind of captured the kind of priorities of the bill, which, you know, make the market accessible for smaller operators and kind of, you know, more expensive for the larger operators. And you kind of chose a combination of the two. You really increased the fees on the high end, you kept them low on the small end, and you decided that you would cover a portion of our budget gap, the kind of delta between our fee revenue and our operating expenses with a portion of the excise tax. But you also put a sunset on that provision in order, because, you know, we were all setting these fees and kind of guessing what the entrepreneurial interest was without ever actually running the experiment. So you put a sunset on that excise tax provision in order to kind of check back in 3 years, you know, what is this delta? How much excise tax are you drawing down? You know, let's have this conversation. So anyway, that's part of the reason why I'm here today, because A, it's just a good time to talk about fees if you're going to do something this biennium. And B, this kind of come up as this check back has arrived. I figured I'd give you just a brief overview of how the market has actually shaped up, so that you can kind of get a sense of where things are at. I guess I should back up just for a second. Under my name, I did submit, you know, we submitted a fee report to this committee of the legislature in December. So you can kind of see all of our fees there and what they're generating in that report if you have a magnifying glass. The fees themselves are in 7 VSA 910. If you want to look there, just kind of see how they kind of shook out. But anyway, the kind of market snapshot as of today, 632 total licensees, 417 of those are cultivators, 92 manufacturers, 2 testing labs, 8 wholesalers, 11 retail shops, 111 retail shops, and 2 of these kind of specialty integrated licenses that you created for the medical dispensaries that existed prior to, you know, adult use. So of the cultivators, 314 of the cultivators, or 75%, are the tier 1, 1,000 square feet or less small cultivators. So to me, that represents a great market capture of the former illicit market. You know, these are the people that were likely growing in their attics or their basements or their garages, you know, that they decided to kind of take a shot at the legal market. So that's great because they brought in a lot of their genetics. We have kind of a very vibrant market, over 4,000 registered unique products. There's over 1,100 active employees in this industry. The taxable sales are a little bit ahead of where JFO originally projected them to be. FY24, it was 124.3 million. That equates to 17.4 million in excise tax. 30% of that number is dedicated to prevention funding. It's kind of determined by the Department of Health in consultation with the Substance Misuse Prevention Advisory Council. And then 7.5 million in sales tax, 6% sales tax. And that money is kind of sent to the Agency of Education to support after-school programming.
Plus local options taxes.
And then the local option tax. I don't have that number here, but yes, if local option taxes, if your town has one, do apply to cannabis sales as well. So there's 1% certain towns. Yes.
And where is that? Does that money stay with the town?
The local option? Yes.
And then 30%, 70% stays with the town, 30% goes to the ed fund, right?
So the 70% goes to the general fund.
Yeah.
And then the 30% is routed to support prevention efforts as recommended by the Department of Health. Yeah.
Oh, so the municipality doesn't keep the.
They keep the 1% local option tax if they have one. They're allowed to assess a $100 fee. And that was kind of one of my considerations that I wanted to flag for you, that there was a lot of debate over should towns have a cost share, is get a portion of the excise tax that, for, expenses related to hosting cannabis establishment. Ultimately, the kind of the House position won the day, House position back in 2020, that no, they should just have a fee that's reflective of those costs, those administrative costs. And, it was all theoretical at the time. So you said at $100, which is pretty nominal, I think, but also, you either increase it and have the licenses cost more, or you leave it low and have them come back after a while, say, did any of their kind of fears materialize? Were there more thefts, robberies? Were there more traffic or other issues related to hosting these things?
Representative Holcomb.
Just deciding whether. This is so helpful, and I really appreciate the fact that you're bringing all the information into. It looks like the rate of growth is slowing. Is that what you
Yes.
expect to happen?
Yes. And that was always anticipated. New York, they took a long time to get their retail licenses issued. So a lot of those border consumers in New York were coming to Vermont. Now they're there's a long line of retail stores right along the kind of western Vermont border now. So we anticipated kind of a leveling off. That could change, of course, if you authorize new license types. And that's one of the things I was going to talk to you, because I know the Senate is considering this.
But just to follow, but that means you hopefully also now have a better sense of what the supply and demand is.
Yes, yes.
Thank you.
Yes, and as far as the leveling off, FY 25, the kind of joint revenue forecast from JFO said that we were going to grow from, it was 124 million in FY 24, FY 25, 148.6 million, which is a 20% increase year over year. And that we're pretty much on track. Under my name also is a presentation that JFO just presented to the Senate Appropriations Committee last week. That kind of shows where cannabis revenue is situated right now. And it goes, and as of kind of March, it's at 108 million in taxable sales. So, given that we have a few months left, I think 148 million is probably right on the nose. And that would be 20.8 million in sales tax, or in excise tax, 8.9 million in sales tax. And they suggest, and the revenue forecast goes out to FY 26. So they're saying 160.7 million in taxable sales, which would be an 8% increase from FY 25. But that's kind of the leveling out point. Nothing can change.
Representative Higley.
Thank you. So I noticed too, in your report, you talked about that $100 fee for the cities, and it looks like over 50% say it's enough, and others say it's not enough, right?
Yes, and really, I think it would be for the cities to come in and kind of justify what their expenses are. I mean, we asked them that early on, what should this local fee be? What kind of expenses are you anticipating? And it was all kind of theoretical and hypothetical. So this committee said, well, do $100, and if it's more than that, come on back and tell us in 3 years.
Mhm.
So I think I just put it in my fee report as something that you should consider, especially take some input from the kind of, I don't know, the league or whomever else about, is that fee adequate? Yeah. So our fees, between July 1st, 2024 and March 15th, 2025 have generated 2.4 million. It's a little bit above, it's probably going to come in a little bit above what we estimated in that fee report. I think partially that's because you kind of have a graduated fee schedule for a certain class of licensees called social equity applicants, where they get a free license in year one, and then they have to pay 25% of the fee in year two, 50% in year three. And so as those kind of the years ratchet on, the fees will increase a little bit if those people stay in the industry. Our budget for FY 26 is $6.5 million. So that's about $4 million from the excise tax that covers our budget. Just a quick word on that. Our staffing really is a function of the market size. There's kind of national averages of number of compliance agents to licensed businesses, number of licensing agents to licensed businesses. On the compliance side, the kind of national average is right around 1 to 60. So one compliance agent for every 60 businesses. Ours is with our kind of 9 compliance officers is 1 to 70, so a little bit above that, but not too bad. And then on the licensing staff to licensee ratio, it's about 1 to 100, 1 to 800 nationally. Ours is 1 to 127. But again, we can manage. But it's just important to consider that if the market were to continue to grow, that unless we kind of cut back on what our regulatory duties are, our staff will continue to grow as well. If we want to maintain kind of compliance and compliance.
Sure.
I'm sure.
James, I was just wondering, the way our licenses are, the intent was for those small growers. So if you look at not just the number of licenses per staff, but in actual revenues per staff, Vermont probably is fairly low, I would think, revenues per staff member.
Yes, and that was kind of an intentional decision. It's kind of a JFO noted this in their original fee report when they were kind of evaluating our fee proposal. It just said, if you want a vibrant market that generates more excise tax, you may have to, lose it on the fee revenue side. You don't necessarily want to maximize fee revenue if you want kind of an accessible market that makes for a more robust market that may actually attract people in from the illicit market or tourists or whatever else.
Yeah.
But yes, you're right on that.
The economies, we face that in other areas of the state as well.
Yeah. And so I was just going to give you some considerations in fee adjustments. And the first one was whether you want to maximize fee revenue versus having an accessible market, for the kind of smaller operators. So that's just one thing. I mean, I know you know that, but it's something to just keep in your mind. I think the other thing is these fees will get eventually passed on to the consumer. So the impact on the price of cannabis. And I say that because this market is a little bit different than the alcohol market. Or the tobacco market. It's got a vibrant illicit market operating right alongside of it. That doesn't have things like potency caps. They can deliver. I think our prosecutors really don't prosecute low level cannabis crimes. So this market does operate. You can go on Instagram and DM someone and get a delivery of cannabis. And then there's also this intoxicating hemp-derived product market that is, I mentioned cannabis is a $33 billion industry. Intoxicating hemp industry is a $28 billion industry. And so, if you don't want to regulate a product in Vermont, you can go online and buy kind of a hemp-infused, joint sponsored by Snoop Dogg or Cheech and Chong and have it delivered to your house through the mail, through interstate commerce. And it's a loophole that was created by the 2018 Farm Bill. I can go into that if you'd like, but it's important to know that the price of cannabis it just can't be way out of sync with the illicit market or the intoxicating hemp market, because those people will shift their kind of purchasing behaviors. The one that we hear quite a bit is needs to take into consideration the relative profitability of the various license types. So you've already said that our fees are not going to meet our operating expenses. So you actually have the justification to increase fees as much as you want, until it hits that kind of, so it meets our operating expenses. But I think what we've heard is that you kind of set, or we recommended you guys set the fees, the differential between indoor and outdoor cultivators. You set the indoor cultivators too low, especially on the higher ends. And there's a number of factors that go into this, but essentially kind of boils down to indoor cultivators can operate year round, as opposed to outdoor cultivators that only have the kind of short frosts. So outdoor cultivators get one harvest, maybe two if they use kind of special kind of genetics. But generally speaking, they get one harvest, whereas indoor cultivators can get a minimum of 4. A good indoor cultivator could maybe they're rotating their plants, kind of growing clones and rotating them in, 4 to 6 harvests a year. So why shouldn't the fees be a straight kind of, 1 to 4 ratio? Every every square foot of canopy on the outdoor side should be a quarter of what they are on the indoor side. That doesn't fully take into account the fact that indoor cultivation has astronomical electricity costs, and all the kind of other aspects around HVAC and, all the kind of startup costs going into building an indoor facility. And then cutting on the other way, it's just outdoor cultivation is just so much better for the environment. It's actually a carbon sequestration activity, versus, this intense environmental footprint that indoor cultivation has. So that's a pretty big one to consider in adjusting fees. That's one that I was asked to kind of look at given our existing licensees, could you create a kind of 1-to-4 ratio that is revenue neutral, given the existing fees? So I actually do have a proposal. It's not my proposal. Someone asked me to create it. But it's something maybe you guys want to consider that cuts the outdoor cultivators, everyone up and down the line, in half. And then it doubles all of the indoor cultivation fees except for tier 1 and tier 2. So the kind of smallest operators kind of held harmless by this change. And it is revenue neutral. It actually increases just ever so slightly projected revenues. So I have that. If you guys want to look at it, who knows? This may come back to you at some point on the miscellaneous cannabis bill that's traveling through. I know it's kind of late in the session to do something like this, but you might see this later this year, or I can walk through it now, but that's the general gist of it. And then the local fee issue is kind of the one other thing that I wanted to just mention, of course, is we did a municipal survey. We've done municipal roundtables. Generally speaking, people are saying that the cost of the local cost, the kind of like the increased thefts, police need new routes, they need to extend their kind of patrols. Those costs have not been realized. We haven't seen major issues that would lead to need for increased police presence. We haven't seen kind of an accelerated road repavement schedule was one of the concerns that people thought if there was increased kind of traffic near cannabis stores. The municipalities, if they want to, can create a local cannabis control commission to review applications. So there is administrative burden there. But I would just leave it to the towns to kind of justify if they need an increased fee. Or you could consider what the Senate kind of initially considered, whether a portion of the excise tax should be shared with towns that, host cannabis establishments, which it wouldn't be the worst thing if I'm editorializing here, but, if there's kind of this mutual kind of benefit between the towns and the cannabis establishments, it can lead to kind of a more, fruitful relationship between those two entities. But anyway, that's less general fun for you all though. So, those are the kind of considerations. I did want to note just 2 issues that may come back your way, that you may need to kind of act on relatively quickly if you want to, because they're being discussed in the Senate Economic Development right now. As related, they've got possession of the H321, the cannabis miscellaneous bill. One is around a pilot program for a farmer's market, cannabis farmer's market. So there's a little bit of context here. New York, I mentioned, when they legalized, they licensed the cultivators first, and then they got into a position where their retail licensing scheme was held up in a court battle for about 2 years. So you had 2 years worth of cultivators cultivating with no legal avenue to sell. So in an emergency rule, they allowed what they call a cannabis grower showcase. And essentially the idea is a minimum of 3 cultivators get together. They apply locally for a farmer's market permit. The local authority can condition that permit however they want. Well, we need more on the security plan. We need you to hire private security. We want a deputy sheriff there, whatever they want goes. Then they apply to the Cannabis Control Commission in New York for a cannabis grower showcase permit. And then their commission evaluates the kind of inventory tracking, point of sale, how they're going to collect kind of excise tax, how they're going to keep people under 21 out. Essentially just the whole kind of regulatory burden that any retailer would have to go into anyway. And then they're kind of off to the races. They can go and kind of have a farmer's market, above 21 adults only farmer's market in a kind of indoor location. It could be outdoors too, but I think most of them in New York are indoors. And, so they did that through emergency rule in 2023 or 2024, and they made it permanent in more recently, earlier this year.
This is New York.
New York, yeah. So they've been doing this for a little while, and none of the kind of fears around kind of being a target for theft or robbery, or diversion, inversion, kids going in. None of that stuff really panned out. So because we have this model to look at from our neighbors, the Senate Economic Development is looking at this issue about whether we should do this in a limited basis, maybe just do a single farmers market this year and see how it goes and report back about whether this should be allowed. So you may see that if it were to happen, it would require a fee. And so you guys would have to kind of decide if this is something you wanted to entertain and what the fee should be. In the proposal that I've been working on with Ledge Council, we created a cost share, just like with an alcohol event, like a limited alcohol event where the town gets half the fee and the state gets the other half. So there's a 50-50 cost share. So anyway, those are some of the considerations around that. I'm happy to answer any questions about that concept. It's very conceptual right now. And I know it's late in the session, so I don't know if you're going to see this or not. But and then the other issue that you may see come back to you on this H320 is this issue around whether you should continue to fund the deficit between the fee revenue and the operating expenses at the CCP with excise tax, or should it just be part of should it just come from the general fund?
So could refresh me with that. We give you money, we have to give you money to operate from the excise tax?
Right. Yeah,
That happens every year.
it happens every year. So there's the Cannabis Regulation Fund, which is the parking spot for all administrative fines, all fees, and all excise tax throughout the year. And then, how the structure works now is when you're approving our budget, you take whatever the difference, you just cover our budget from that fund, and the rest transfers to the general fund with that 70-30 split. You kind of put the sunset on the excise tax traveling through that fund. So without that if that sunset takes effect, which it's set to do, the cannabis excise tax every month will just be deposited directly into the general fund. And then our budget for you. Well, yeah, then you'd have to use the portion of the general fund to fund our budget. So, I think the real decision point there is, the way that I see it is that, cannabis is a controversial issue. Plenty of Vermont taxpayers, I hear from them all the time, that never wanted this industry to be launched to begin with. So I don't, those folks, I think, take issue with the fact that their general fund dollars are going to support our functions and they're not benefiting from this system. So doesn't it make sense to allow the industry through the fees and the consumers through the excise tax self-fund the kind of people that are benefiting, they're the ones that are benefiting from the work that we do, kind of regulated products. So I'm sure there's good arguments to go the other way, but that's just kind of the kind of choice that this committee made back in 2022 and will have to make again. Push out that sunset or not.
Sure. Can I ask you about the farmer's market before you go too far?
Yeah, well, that's the end. So yeah, please, anything. Yeah.
I'm just thinking that the retailers that just paid for their license and are operating a facility 12 months a year are probably not thrilled with the idea of somebody standing up a farmer's market. Right?
Yes, and the way that I was asked how can you structure a farmer's market so that you doesn't increase any of your resource needs at the board? And one of the easier ways to do it is having some limiting principles in it. I do it as a pilot and see if it works. And one of the limiting principles is that it would have to run, first of all, limit the number of them either, or the kind of like length of time that they could happen, put a sunset, have this authority go away in 6 months or something like that. The other limiting principle is require that the person applying for the permit be a retailer. So they have to get at least 3 cultivators on board. And then they're the ones that are in charge of insuring the event, paying the fees, and if there's any issues around security or inversion, diversion, youth access, tax avoidance, whatever, their license is the one that gets dinged. So that, I mean, it's a limiting principle just because, it kind of shifts the burden onto the retailers.
And it's, you may hear from cultivators who obviously would like to be able to have direct sales. So part of my job in the background is to make sure that things we are told to do can be administered and in the practical world effectively and not incompetently. And it really is an administrative necessity if we are to have effective age gating, health warning, excise tax collection, inventory tracking, that there be retailer mediation. The whole system is set up around it. And I think another issue is sheer numbers. There are, 400 cultivators, some very small. We have a field staff of 9 and they're strapped now. When I talked to my colleagues, my counterpart in Connecticut, she said, well, why do you guys spend so much time on cultivators? It's not very hard for us. And I said, what are you talking about? She said, we have 3. They have 3 giant cultivators. And, when the regulator says jump, they say how high. They don't say, maybe you've heard about the Constitution or whatever.
Yeah.
And so we put a lot of, which they do. Nobody jumps when I ask. But an important thing to understand from a policy perspective is that this body has asked us as a regulator to do something really unique and nurture these small cultivators. We really succeeded in a big way. That doesn't mean each one of them is succeeding. Some of them are losing money and won't persist in the marketplace, but a lot of them are succeeding. And a lot of them are doing what they want with their land and their livelihood. We've been tremendously successful at that, but one of the costs is we've got all these little entities to look after, and we have to corral them all into a fairly complex regulatory structure that involves inventory tracking through computers and, fairly rigorous compliance transportation standards to prevent things like theft. We had one in the news very recently that you may have seen. So for all those reasons, I just kind of want to emphasize that although you may hear from folks in the cultivation world about their desire to kind of have a very different structure, implementing any kind of it is just so impractical from an administrative perspective, not from a ideological or policy perspective, that it just isn't something we could do. So I've got to try to have this conversation with them. They're kind of like, well, if you really wanted to. And if we really wanted to, we just aren't built for it.
Yeah.
So, Mr. Gilman, we appreciate your input, but could you identify yourself for the record?
Of course, my name is Gabriel Gilman. I am the Cannabis Control Board's general counsel. I'm sorry for not saying that when I started talking.
Representative Higley.
Yeah, thanks. So if it's going to require retailers to be able to, only retailers to be able to have these farmers markets, and it sounds like there's an additional cost to that, why would they be interested in doing that? Again, now I know when you go into a shop, you have to sign in. Are those sorts of things going to be required as well, or don't know?
It would certainly no one under 21, so there'd be some ID check at the door. We kind of, just given that this is, we expect this to be a temporary in pilot, and what the kind of language says is they need to present us with plans, procedures to ensure proper age verification, proper security, proper insurance, local sign off. And so, a lot of the details will have to get worked out, but, the kind of basic structure would be recreate kind of a retail shop off premises and allow cultivators to interact with customers directly.
Oh, Thanks.
But the kind of, the sales would happen through the retailer's point of sale system and be tracked that way. So I don't have much else to share. I mean, the thing is I have the fee proposal that was kind of requested of me that reduces indoor fees, or reduces outdoor fees, increases indoor fees.
This is one of your,
No, it's not. I mean, we can look at it here today, or you can just wait to see if the Senate has any appetite for it. I mean, it's very late in the game to doing kind of big changes, and get all the kind of testimony in place to hear what the impact might be of those changes.
so you don't want to share the screen, can you,
Um,
if you send it to Sorsha, and you can send it to us?
Yep.
Please.
James, while you're finding that,
Yeah.
the ability to fund the operations of the Cannabis Control Board through the excise tax and the separation of that, is that supposed to sunset at the end of this calendar year, or what is that?
yeah, at the end of this fiscal year, it sunsets. And so if there were to be.
25, so on July 1st?
Yeah, so if there were to be a change, it would probably have to have a year delay.
Yeah,
Either way, no matter how you do it. Because not only is the budget being kind of finalized now, the joint, revenue forecast anticipated that excise tax in FY 26 would be deposited directly into general fund. So they built all their projections with that in mind. So nothing can kind of change for FY 26, but if you did want to continue funding the board with excise tax, which is how it's going to work for FY 26, by the way.
yeah, okay.
Then you would have to do it effective FY 27.
Okay. Thank you.
Too many puns. This is a Word document. Is that a problem description?
I'll turn it into, no, it's not, I'm just gonna send it to them.
Okay.
And then I'll-
See if I have.
So we should look on our email.
I don't have it yet, I'll let you know when I send it.
Sorry about that. I didn't know exactly what you guys were thinking about talking about today, so.
Well, it works out if we have time, right?
Yeah, I know, which is never the case. I really actually, I really enjoy having some flexibility there. This is like,
Sent it, taking a few moments to post it on the website for the.
It looks like there's a possibility of a lot of changes coming over from Senate on 321, correct?
if the changes that they would be discussing are these three things, the change to the fees, if they do it. I don't know. There's certainly a push amongst the industry to do it. And then it would be the event licensing pilot, and then maybe this excise tax funding the board. Yeah, so those would be the three changes, 321 that the Senate is looking at.
Because I know initially it was, a retailer, new license for trim and harvest and a
Right.
few other issues.
Yeah,
So
right,
it's-
right.
Yeah.
321 was pretty much, I mean, important bill, but not a lot of policy change. Yeah.
That's very new.
Forgotten about a lot of the stuff that we looked at before.
Somebody have it Ed?
So the basic, gist here is, I guess cut all the outdoor cultivators in half. Eliminate tier 6, which is a tier that, when we were in the ether pre-market of trying to decide what the appropriate market structure was, we had no idea what you were going to set fees at or whether there was going to be any entrepreneurial interest at all in joining this kind of regulated market, the small cultivators. So while we wanted to rely on small cultivators, we didn't know if we needed to have larger tiers in our back pocket. You know, if no one decided to join the regulated market, and we didn't want to kind of just have no licensed cannabis to sell. So we created some larger tiers. We never opened tier 6, and I don't think the board ever would. So might as well just eliminate it on the indoor and outdoor side. Probably could do the same with tier 5, but there are some existing tier 5s that might be impacted by that. And then kind of a doubling of all the indoor fees except for that tier 1 small cultivator. Eliminating tier 6. And then the mixed cultivation tiers is really we created this license type to kind of understand that we wanted to prioritize outdoor cultivation, some of the environmental concerns that we raised. But we wanted it to be we wanted people to grow outside when they could and then move indoors when they could not. So we do have a mixed cultivation tier that allows for a small portion of indoor canopy and outdoor canopy. And so that fee is just currently just a summation of those kind of 2 fees, the indoor fee and the outdoor fee. So those all had to be adjusted because to accommodate the kind of the 50% reduction and the doubling. And that's really all there is to this.
So the fiscal impact,
Fiscal impact given our current set of licensees. So if this doesn't kind of force anyone out of the market on the indoor side, would be actually a little bit, it's like $60,000 more than what we take in now. So so essentially no impact.
but might force some of those smaller operations out.
The tier 2s, maybe. And yeah, I mean, I think that they're generally speaking doing pretty well relative profitability wise compared to outdoor counterparts, but it may, and that's the kind of thing where it's kind of late in the game to try and dramatically change the fees. This isn't really dramatic, but I would assume you'd want to hear some testimony from someone impacted by this change.
Would changing this bring any more of those parallel operators into the fold? And how big is that?
Yeah,
It's a 70-30, 60-40, 80-20. What does that look like in terms of who's in which lane?
yeah. You're talking about the illicit market versus the regulated market?
Yeah.
Well, we are currently living under a self-imposed moratorium on issuing licenses. The board voted not to issue new licenses. I mentioned we hired an economist to kind of look at the demand for cannabis. Well, in addition to kind of you guys looking at fees every 3 years, we're bringing in an economist to reevaluate that exact question. How much more capacity is there? What would the impact of bringing in more cultivators have on public health outcomes, on price of cannabis, viability of these smaller operators, et cetera? Kind of all that kind of look at what does the market look like now, both on the illicit side and the regulated side, and whether there's more capacity to open up to reopen licensing for cultivators. So changing the fees right now actually it will only impact the existing businesses because they have to renew annually. But it won't have the effect of bringing in new people, because until we have that kind of economic analysis, we're not going to probably open up cannabis licensing unless something dramatic happens. I mean, the flood that happened in July of 2024 wiped out, I think, 12,000 square feet of outdoor canopy. And so things happen and you need to add more. If you did capture more of the market on the consumer side, then you need more canopy, you need to have more licensed growers. So if the market changes, the dynamics shift because of policy decisions or because of extreme weather events, or on the flip side of, tourism is down and, a lot of these things impacts just the need for more or less licensed canopy.
James. So the 3 fees, the indoor, outdoor, changing, reorganizing that, cultivators, a local fee for the municipality that's hosting, that needs to be adjusted. And then the pilot program for farmers market. Those are the three recommendations.
Those are I just wanted to prepare this committee for what's potentially coming back over. That's what the Senate Economic Development and then eventually the Senate Finance Committee will be discussing.
Those three.
I don't know how they're going to land on any of those things, but it's probably good for you to be oriented to them now as opposed to kind of midnight on the last day of the session. Yeah.
Any questions? Thank you. Thank you both.
Thank you. Thank you.
Folks, we are done for the morning. If folks could come back very, very promptly after the floor, we have a limited window with legislative counsel on a bill that got referred to us, which is about Baldwin Road, I think.
Oh.
Prime Woods